Yeah. Hey there, Dan Fitzpatrick here, stockmarketmentor.com, and let's look at Broadcom here, AVGO, AVGO. Now, this is pretty interesting. You can see the big breakout here. They actually had some news on Wednesday about some partnerships and various other things that were actually pretty bullish. Frankly, I missed those. So did the market. Just kind of sitting, farting around here. And then the next day, that was Thursday, yesterday, we got a little bit of move, but look at the volume. Like this was all kind of average volume. This was a little bit above here, but I'm not going to split hairs on that. You can try to find freaking meaning in every little tick on the chart. And all it does is impress people who don't know very much and who don't know enough not to be impressed. Bottom line is this thing is just wiggling, jiggling. But then today we got this big breakout. Like this had been a trend line that I had drawn just yesterday because I wanted to know when this stock was going to break out. And it did today. But this is what's interesting. A couple things. First of all, they report next week. I think that's Wednesday. Yeah, on June 3rd. So the question is this stock actually now anticipating a great number to a point where a good number would just kind of cause maybe a gap and crap or something like that? In other words, is the market now starting to, after a period of consolidation here, is the market starting to price in a really good number so that it's like nothing that they could do would surprise the market to a point where they decide they're going to keep going? I mean, we saw that like with Nvidia, which this stock they reported great numbers, but the stock really didn't do anything, and now it's down lower. So this is a little bit different setup, but this is what I found interesting. If you look at the intraday chart here, let me change this to market to data for regular hours only. Okay, daily, 30 minute, 15 minute, 1 minute, forget that. Let's go 5 minutes. Okay, you can see first thing in the morning, this thing jumped out. Okay. And I remember looking at it, and frankly, it kind of looked like a false breakout. It pulled back here quite a bit, almost 3% from the high, like down around 440, right? And so if you look at where 440 was on the chart, it was like right about here. So when this stock pops up and then it comes back down, I'll be honest with you, I thought, okay, well, let's see what happens on Monday because this could be a really nice trade into earnings. So apparently everybody else thought that way too. Definitely in the afternoon after one, it's almost like a sell program came in or something. If we look at the cues, you can kind of see a similar move down. So everything was kind of trading down in tech land. But then this thing had a volatility squeeze. Again, this is a 5 minute chart, but it had a volatility squeeze below the volume weighted average price, which this had traded down below. You only really want to be long a stock if it's back above the VWAP. So it started to tick up. Volume also started to tick up. But then, like, look what happened right at the end of the day, right into the close. That's 3:55 and then 4 o'clock here. Look at the massive volume here. I mean, it really, really surprised me, frankly. The way it traded here, here's the 15-minute chart, 30-minute chart shows it a little bit differently, but you can see the whole thing. Like it just really traded down in the middle of the day. And you would have thought, at least I would have thought, that it really wouldn't do anything. Now, options expired today. So that's always a big mover on something like this because it's got weekly options. But this is the way I look at it. We always want to know what institutions are doing. And because we don't want to follow those institutions. We want to be riding along with them. And what I mean by that is I want to buy the damn thing and then let the institutions keep buying it and make me money. I don't want to keep buying it along with them. I want to hop on board and then, let them turn the wheels or paddle or whatever you want to call it if you're driving or on a boat or a plane. I just want to be a passenger, but I got to get on there. And so the question is, When will we know, like on an intraday basis, when will we know if this swoon, because pretty much every stock drifts sideways in the middle of the day. That's just when the algorithms kind of take over and they don't do much. But you want to know, are the institutions buying or selling all day? And so if you look at just the way this thing trades along the volume weighted average price, I would have to conclude that they're selling, especially when you see this. You say, okay, well, institutions, I guess they've done all their buying here. They've got big orders to fill, but maybe they've done all their buying here and they're not going to do anything else. Or maybe this was kind of a retail type of buying, and now the institutions have come in and now they're starting to sell. But what you need to understand is on big stocks like this, the trading desks, the big institutional desks, they have orders to fill, either buy or sell, and they've got all day or all week, whatever it is. They've got all day or all week to fill those orders. No, the person or fund ordering it, maybe it's an insurance company, a pension fund, just a dude with a lot of wealth, whatever, hedge fund. They don't care what your cost basis is at 12:59 in the afternoon. They could give a rip. All they care about is you getting back to them at the end of the day or at the end of the week. I mean, it used to be in a phone call. Now it's like you turn on your computer monitor. But they want to know at the end of the period where the order's supposed to be filled, what was the average price that you filled the order? Like, was it a low price? Was it a high price? Don't tell me that you got filled like right at the top of the range. Don't tell me that. And so what you'll often find is traders, again, a lot of it's algorithmic, but it's just because that's kind of how orders are filled these days. What will happen is traders will have a big order to fill, and in this case, you say like, "Oh, okay, well they're buying the stock. They're cleaning up a buy order." We don't know that for sure. But see, what happens is as the stock drifts sideways, these traders pulls back to the VWAP and they're buying gently. Not a lot, but they're gradually filling their order. They get a low cost basis. They're even filling it down here. The stock isn't cratering or anything. It's just kind of gradually moving lower in the afternoon. They're filling their orders a little bit. Meanwhile, we don't know whether they're buying or selling. We don't know what's going on. We just see this like, okay, well, this thing looks like it's out of gas. Meanwhile, the people that are filling these orders, it's getting to be around 3, and they're looking at their clock, they're looking at the order and saying, you know what? We got a pretty low cost basis in this all the way down here. We've got just 10% of the order left to fill. Screw it, let's do it. Let's just buy the stinking thing so we can get on with our weekend. Because if you're only filling like 10% of the order, that's not going to, even if it's at a higher price, it's not going to raise the average, the cost basis of the stock that you're buying because it's only 10%. You're buying it for, you're buying it for a little bit higher price, but you don't care. You got to get the thing done. And so that's what we see happening here. So we just move and then bam, right here at the end. So how do we play that? I didn't see, I saw it towards the end of the day and grabbed some call options actually. But at least the way I look at it is, okay, here's a 15-minute chart. I see how this traded down. It squirted up right at the end of the day. Institutions don't day trade. This is a tip-off that there's a lot of institutional buying of this stock. I mean, 5 million shares traded during the last 15 minutes of the trading day. That's kind of a lot, all right? 3 million shares traded during the last 5 minutes. So this is a big, massive tell, in my view anyway, of what's likely to happen on Monday, of what's likely to happen next week as this runs into earnings. My bet is that you're going to see more buyers coming for this stock, and it will continue to run at least for a couple days. Now, it may kind of wiggle and jiggle here a little bit, but I think that that type of movement would just be kind of trying to shake the trees, shake the leaves, see if you get anything that falls. In other words, get the weak hands to sell. But I think there's going to continue to be more buying into the first part of the week. I have no clue what the market's reaction to earnings will be. And if you know somebody who says that they do know what it's going to be, you need to laugh at their face and call them idiots because they are, or liars, or probably both. Nobody really knows. But if this stock, I'll even give you a price level. The high here was 448.90. So let's do this. 448.95. I'll make that a green one. Okay. So that's my trigger. You always want to have a trigger like, what am I trying to do here? If this stock runs above today's intraday high, 448.90, and this thing closed really, really close to that. If it runs above there, then I think this is going to be a continued breakout. And I think my call options are going to do pretty well. So anyway, that's all I got for you. Look, if you're not a member of Stock Market Mentor, we've got a lot of good things going over there. I invite you to join. Like it's 14 bucks, excuse me, it's only $7 for 14 days. We've got a lot of trades going on. And what we do is we focus on our multiples. In other words, it's not what your percent gain is, it's what you're making for every dollar that you're risking. So we focus on risk. So you risk a little bit of money and make a lot relative to the risk. That's the way professionals trade. That's the way we trade. And that's the way I want you to trade. Okay. So that's all I got for you. And I will see you next time.